Kia ora koutou, my name is Daniel O'Brien. I'm an assistant principal at St Thomas of Canterbury College in Christchurch, New Zealand. It's an absolute pleasure to be involved in the World eConference on Restorative Justice through relational schools. It's something that I find a fascinating subject and could speak for hours on, but today I'm going to talk to you around sustaining restorative practices in schools, particularly from my experience in a single-sex New Zealand boys' school, one that has had a strong history in restorative practices dating back to 2006-2007 when it was implemented as a result of the statistics that were coming through showing that punitive measures at the time were not working. Today I'm going to talk about three key elements that we find help sustain restorative practices in our school. The first being, the foundation stone of what we would consider restorative practice, and that is the building of relationships. Secondly, I'm going to talk about staff engagement and how you can work to keep staff engaged in the restorative process. And finally, we're going to talk about how trauma and adverse childhood experiences play a factor in how we build these relationships and how restorative practices play such an important part in supporting students as they develop through their teenage years. A little bit about myself. I've been a teacher for nearly 15 years. I began at the University of Queensland studying teaching and worked for about a year in both boys and girls schools in Brisbane before moving to Dublin, Ireland. I worked there for 5 years and in 2011 moved to Christchurch, spending the rest of the time in New Zealand, apart from a 1-year stint coaching in Japan. So my experience throughout the world has been really interesting and has supported sort of my thoughts on what it takes to be effective both in the classroom and in building relationships. What I found was that actually I didn't realize I was a relational restorative justice teacher before I knew exactly what restorative justice was. I found that I was actually having restorative chats well before I knew what the actual term was. And that's something that formed my style of teaching through storytelling and building strong relationships with my students. Actually helped me get closer and more supportive to the students, and in the end they were actually benefited by that relationship. A little bit of a history around the school. In 2006, or between 2001 and 2006, the school had over 240 stand-downs, suspensions and exclusions across those 5 years. Now, since bringing restorative justice into the school, from 2007 up until March of 2021, we've had a little over 30 stand-down suspensions or exclusions. So a massive change in our statistics. And the one really interesting thing there was between 2001 and 2006, there was a student population of around 380 students, less than 400. Whereas today we are approaching 700 students. So while we have nearly doubled in size, we're actually limiting the number of students who have been moved away from classroom settings, which is a fantastic result for the school. As I said, the first thing I'm going to talk about today is building relationships, and that is the foundation stone for restorative justice, and the foundation stone not only in establishing restorative justice in schools, but also in sustaining what you do. In New Zealand, there is a term called whakawhanaungatanga, and this is the idea of building relationships, and this is what we hang our hat on when it comes to our school. We've decided to create a senior dean role, and that senior dean is in charge of restorative practices, and their role is purely around making sure that our teachers are skilled in the building of relationships, both with fellow staff and also with students. And we also place focus on making sure that our students are able to build relationships with each other. We find students in years 7 to 10 find it difficult to work out what a positive, strong relationship is. And those students in years 11 to 13 have different difficulties that they have to face, but again, the importance is on having strong connections and relationships. And this is something as a school we really focus on. So as a senior leadership team, our mantra to the staff are, we have to build connections before content. So we ask our staff at the start of the year not to worry about the academic side of schooling, but actually to get to know their students, to understand who that student is, where they're coming from, what makes them tick. So those connections make sure that we are able to identify and preempt issues that are coming. It also allows us to build those relationships, as I said before. So that focus on repairing and rebuilding after harm has been done, by having a restorative practices dean, we're actually trying to preempt the actual harm from occurring. And that's something we've really tried to focus on in this last year or two, to make sure that our students understand that there's someone on staff who is there to support them no matter what. And that comes through the idea of relational currency. So this idea of relational currency is about building strong relationships with students and with fellow staff, knowing that if you understand that student, if you get to know them, if you are able to understand where they're coming from, when times get hard and things go wrong and events occur and we have to deal with these issues, that relational currency that you've built with them is there, so that you may need to draw on that. You may need to ask them to do something that is quite difficult for them. So for us, it's about working with the students. We're not doing the work for them. We're not punitive and doing it to them. We're working with them, which means you've got a high level of structures and systems in place, but also there's high accountability. We don't just think that students should get away with things. And the fact that we don't stand students down as the first option means that we have to work with our students. We have to work hard. We have to build these relationships. And so one thing with restorative justice, it's actually really hard work. And sustaining restorative justice practices in a school is very difficult. It's something you have to do every day. And that's something that I guess for us is around culture. Culture is one of the most important things in building really strong relationships. Culture isn't something you say you have to live your culture. And at St. Thomas's, the restorative practices are at the very heart of what we do. They're at the very heart of our culture. So everything we do within our educated heart and our educated mind is around making sure that we're restorative in our approach, that we're restorative in our ability to build our relationships. Really important thing is, once we do get to that point where harm has been done and there is a need to repair a relationship, that we are concentrating on building empathy. And for young men, this is hugely important. We often find that a young man finds it difficult to actually empathize with those around them, especially when harm has come about. So it's about sitting that person down in a restorative conference and allowing them to see the impact of their actions. Of course, there's going to be consequences that come from that, but probably the most important thing that we can do is actually help that young person understand what they've done, to who they've done it to, and to the effect of their actions. It's also that ability to move from that limbic to the neocortex part of the brain. Young men are often very emotional, or are often reactionary in what they do. So they often sit in that brain stem section of the brain, that fight, flight, or freeze. When we are practicing restorative practices and restorative justice, what we see is we're able to teach them how to move to various parts of their brains. So to be emotive when they need to be, but also to take in their learnings from their neocortex. So the skills of our facilitators is within a conference is to be able to say, or to get the emotion out of the young men, but then also to move them into that neocortex side of the brain, so they actually take some learning, they actually realize what empathy is as well. And young men, probably the most important part that I guess plays a part with these boys is actually making sure that they understand how to empathize, but also how to articulate emotion. Articulating emotion for them is quite difficult, and it often comes out in physical outbursts. So to be able to articulate how they feel is hugely powerful. This all comes from building relationships. If we can build really strong relationships and sustain those relationships, we're able to make sure that throughout a 5 or 7 year period of this student being at our school, they're developing as young people. And so that when they do leave school, they are able to articulate themselves really well. And for us, we don't see it as a failure if a student has to go through a number of restorative justice conferences. In fact, that's a real success. The more opportunities we have to give our young men to sit in a conference and to be either the wrongdoer or the actual victim allows them to see and to grow, to see the impact of their actions and to grow from those impacts. The second thing that's really important for us is around sustaining restorative justices through staff engagement. As everyone knows who works in the education system, without strong staff, a good staff and a good culture, it's very difficult to be successful. Now, schools are measured on their academic success, and we are no different. We do put a huge focus on our academic success, but at the same time, academic success is very much second to the relationship building and the health and well-being of a student. We know that if a student is happy and safe, they will achieve. That's as simple as that. They turn up to school, they're happy, they're safe, they have strong relationships, they feel a connection to our school, they will succeed academically. For us, it's all about building systems and structures so that our staff are confident and certain in what we have in place through restorative justices. And this is a failing that could happen in schools where systems and structures do not accompany restorative justice. A lot of schools will say they are restorative justice, but they are very quick to stand down a student or to exclude that student as a first case or a first point of call when an incident does occur. Now, it's really difficult to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of being punitive in the way you approach things, and we all do it. We all move into that punitive side of the mind. But as I said before about culture, it's a livable thing, so you have to be living that relational currency that we spoke of before and that restorative justice philosophy. So in every action we see throughout the day, we have to make that decision to actually work with the student. Now, of course, it's really important that with those systems and structures, you're making sure that staff know that everyone is safe and that we're able to support everyone that is involved in this issue that's occurred, and making sure that there is a very real outcome to what's happened. That it's not a simple apology and you're back in a classroom. It's not a simple apology and we forget what's happened. Restorative justice is more than that. And so when it comes to systems and structures, another really important thing is also making sure that there's accountability and outcomes. Okay, so restorative justice is not without outcome. It's not without some sort of accountability where someone understands that they have actually done something that's caused harm, and it's about repairing that harm. As I mentioned before, we have a senior dean that's in charge of restorative practice. We then also have the senior dean in charge of restorative justice. And their job is to facilitate as many conferences as they can at the higher end, but also to support our deans in the everyday restorative conferences that occur, as well as supporting teachers to have restorative chats throughout their class times. It's really important that we've split the two, restorative justice and restorative practice deans, because what we want to do is we want to preempt and show people how to build relationships through our restorative practice dean, but we also want to make sure that we repair harm through our restorative justice dean. So we've split the two to make sure that we've got a two-pronged approach, one that's preemptive and the other one that repairs the harm. And this helps staff understand and helps sustain our system, because staff know that if something does happen, if there is an issue that has occurred between two students or a staff member and a student, that we have very real processes in place that can support that repairing of harm, and it goes to build a stronger relationship. The other thing it does with staff when we have strong relationship building and systems and structures in place, to retain staff engagement, we also try and let them into the world of the student. Now, it's really important when you connect before you do your content, you get to know your students clearly. And when you do get to know them, you understand where they're coming from. And there's a number of things like adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs as they're known, and trauma-based backgrounds that we have in our classroom every single day. And whether you think you're in a school that doesn't or isn't affected by these things, you most probably are. And so often it's about getting our staff to realise that actually in their class, they might have one or two students who have huge risk factors associated with their lives. These factors may impact on them socially and emotionally, physically, and academically, of course. So getting staff to understand that they play a huge part in creating a safe environment for their students is really, really important. And generally, teachers get into the profession because they have that caring nature. It's a human relationship that they are so good at, and it's the reason why they got into teaching. So we need to draw upon that to make sure we can sustain restorative justice practices in our school. Building a staff that's empowered by restorative practice is so powerful. If you can have a staff that live restorative justice, that are advocates for it, you can see a whole culture change within your school. and people won't refer to a punitive system or a punitive measure straight away. They will look for the restorative approach. They will look to build their relationships, and that's hugely powerful in a school setting. It comes down to being able to provide staff with the skills to build relationships. Also, to move away from that traditional, especially in a boys' school, we often see traditional boys' schools are very punitive in their nature. For us, we are very much the opposite. As I mentioned before, our statistics have changed. We have awesome staff who are really quick to try and build relationships. They understand the power of this relationship building. So whanau tanga is a real catchphrase for us, that idea of relationships. It's at the very heart of everything we do. Finally, I want to talk about our trauma and adverse childhood experience background for students. For us, it's about developing connections, as I said. A number of students who have these ACEs and students who come from trauma-based backgrounds, whether it be physical or emotional violence at home, they have huge risk factors associated with them. Risks of failing academically, of having poor mental health, of really suffering socially and emotionally. And it's about trying to create connections so that we can actually provide a protective factor that supports their development. It could be their one saving grace. And we all know that students often find schools are their safe haven, and creating those safe havens is really important to us. I find it really extraordinary when you have students who often misbehave in school, and the punitive measure of standing them down or removing them from the classroom is the first option. And I think I was reading something the other day where a student had been stood down, removed from the school due to a lack of attendance. And the irony in that for me was just shows a traditional view on being punitive in the classroom. If you can actually engage with students and understand that they want to be at school, often that's the students who are struggling the most away from school are the ones who have the best attendance. They want to be there. So with students who have trauma-based backgrounds or ACEs, it's all about trying to make sure that they are feeling supported and they are safe. Now, an ACE is something that can have an impact on their lives. So it could be a separation of parents, it could be drug use in families, it could be environmental factors or environmental events such as the Christchurch earthquake or the mosque shootings. These things play a part and add up in, I guess, the overall impact on a student. So it's widely known that if a student has 4 ACEs, that they have a number of impacts on them. Those impacts can include things like whether you have a certain life expectancy. So I have some statistics here from the World Health Organization that shows that adults who have 4 or more ACEs are 30 times more likely to attempt suicide, 4 times more likely to suffer depression, 10 times more likely to abuse drugs, and those with 6 ACEs or more will have a life expectancy of 20 years less than someone without those ACEs. So for us, identifying students with ACEs and then to be able to engage them in restorative practices is hugely beneficial, because as I said, we've created a safe haven for them. They want to come to school, and what we get out of that is that we are providing protective factors to support them. Those protective factors often can be family, can be social connections, school, their own personality. This alleviates the risk factors. So in a restorative practice school, we are working to build relationships. And for these students from trauma-based backgrounds, relationships are often the things that they are lacking the most. So if we can build those relationships, if we can support those students and provide them with higher systems and structures and expectations, then we're actually providing protective factors for them to actually survive. One of the really key things for us is to make sure that we help develop empathy. And empathy is at the very heart of restorative practice. Restorative Justice Conference comes down to understanding how you've wronged someone, the harm that you've caused to others, and making sure that you can repair that harm. So for students with trauma-based backgrounds or students with high number of ACEs, empathy is a key part in helping them to survive those important years where they can make decisions that are often impacting on their overall academic or social or emotional strength that they have. So as you can see, restorative justice plays a really key part in life in schools, and our school particularly. It's a school that doesn't fit the mold of a traditional boys' school, a boys' school that is punitive in the way it approaches student behaviour. We deal with behaviour, but we want to get to know what is creating that behaviour, why students are acting the way they are. That's the most important thing for us. So in sustaining a restorative justice culture in a school, you really need to make sure that you're developing your relationships, that you're engaging staff and showing that the system works and there are structures in place to support staff. Because in the end, they will want outcomes. They want to make sure that what is happening is good for the student, and it actually creates a really strong environment for everyone to move forward and repair harm. And finally, when it comes to trauma and students who have a number of adverse childhood experiences in their background, it's really about not only creating those connections and building relationships, but it's also about developing their ability to empathize with others, the thing that's often lacking the most in their life. For me, restorative justice is a culture, and a culture is something that you can't say you do without living it. So when you are trying to sustain restorative justice in a school, it's about every day turning up and making sure that all of your decision making is around repairing harm, repairing relationships, and if you can, building those relationships as strong as possible. I really love our term that we use, that idea of relational currency. It's about making sure you're building those connections, making sure that you're there to support the students, but at the same time you have high expectations. It's not good enough to say an action is okay just because of a student's background. It's actually more important to help them realize the outcomes of their actions, who they've harmed, and support them through that. Because of all the things that go with that, the ability to be in a class rather than be sitting out being excluded is hugely important. We know in New Zealand that if you attend school 90% of the time in year 10, you will achieve level 3 in year 13. So we want kids in schools, we want to make sure we're building really strong relationships, and we want to upskill our staff to make sure that they can build those relationships. So when the term gets long and everyone's getting tired and everyone's getting busy, that relational currency is there that we can use to make sure that those high expectations are always met, that we are there for our students, but at the same time making sure that they have a high amount of support, because not every student is the same, and that's the key, making sure we get to know every individual in our class and being there to support them. Thanks very much.